My name is Jeff Wasserstrom, and it's a tremendous honor for me and pleasure to get to host this conversation with two very talented creative figures. And this will be recorded, so some of you will probably be listening to this after the fact, but I'll be speaking now to those of you who are here live. If you want to ask a question, we will have a question and answer. You can just put your question in the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to those at some point after we have them speak. There will be some music and there will be some reading of literature. I thought I'd just give a couple of comments about the idea for bringing together a musician like Wu Fei and a writer like Te-Ping Chen for the same event. This is, to do the whole sort of best of times, worst of times, this is a really terrible time for US-China mutual relations and the political sphere, the diplomatic sphere. And it's also a very harsh time for stereotypes flying from both directions, from the Chinese mainland and from the United States toward the other country. So what's the best of times? I mean, the best of times, I think, is that there is, if you look for it, and if you know where to look for it, and if you're interested in finding it, this is a time when a lot of really interesting creative work is being done that pushes back against the trend toward mutual demonization and mutual stereotyping. In my mind, I think of this in part, the films, The Farewell and American Factory, in very different ways, were two really interesting films that moved between China and the United States in unexpected ways. There are also some things going on online, which, at least for those who are sort of following China from the United States, but are possible for people in other places or interested in the United States from China. So, for example, there's a podcast. One of the people involved in it is a former UCI undergrad, so I'll give a shout out for that, called Loud Murmurs, which is a Chinese language podcast in which they talk about American popular culture and how it's being received inside of China. There's a online venture, Chinese Storytellers, that's particularly about amplifying the voices of Chinese writing in English, Chinese Americans, Chinese diaspora from other places, from China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong. It amplifies their voices. New Voices is another venture like that, which is specifically amplifying the voices of women communicating about China. There are other things. The Asian American Writers Workshop, where Te-Ping is hosting Te-Ping's formal launch of her book, Land of Big Numbers, later today, is another kind of web venture that goes against the grain of kind of insularity and things like that. Words Without Borders, the translation site, often pays attention to China. The list goes on and on. Sup China, China File, there are a variety of places to turn online. So those go against the grain. And the writer, Te-Ping Chen, whose short story collection launches today, Land of Big Numbers. I was lucky enough to read it in galleys, and it's a wonderful book, and it's getting deserved raves. And Wu Fei's musical work on her own, and also in collaboration with Abigail Washburn, an American musician who's had a long engagement with China. These are all kinds of ventures that blur what can be a very harsh divide and work against the grain of misunderstanding. So I'm really delighted. I want to thank the UCI Illuminations Program and the Center for Asian Studies for making this possible. And now I'll try to shut up and give more over to my two wonderful guests. And what I'd like them to do first is share publicly what we began to do privately in the green room when they just first met each other, which is to have each of them tell the story of their crossing between China and the United States. Because as you'll see, one grew up in China and then has spent a lot of time in the US. The other is born in the US, has spent a lot of time in China. So would you begin, Te-Ping, and then we'll pass it over to Wu Fei after that.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Yes, I grew up in the United States. I was born and raised in California, in Oakland, California. And when I was in college, I made my first trip to China in 2006. and since then have spent a number of years going back and forth between China and the US, living in Harbin, in Chengdu, and then more recently, starting in 2012 in Hong Kong as a reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and then in 2014 moving to the mainland, to Beijing, where happily it turns out I moved not too far away from where Fei actually, her family has roots too. We lived in Beijing, and yeah, just really delighted to get to have this conversation.
Fei?
Oh, hi everyone. My name is Wu Fei, and I was raised and born in Beijing from and the first 21 years of my life. Yeah, my mother was raised in the neighborhood where Te-Ping lived for several years before she moved back to the States. I know, such a. And I went to, when I came to the States as an undergrad student, I actually did my master's degree at Mills College in Oakland, California. That's where Te-Ping's hometown is. So that's such a wonderful crossover. And so we were just chatting about where our favorite dim sum is in Oakland, and sweet memories. And I moved to, actually I came to, from Beijing to Denton, Texas for the 2 years, at University of North Texas, did the music there, and then moved to Oakland, California, and then moved to Boulder, Colorado after that, and then moved to Brooklyn, New York, and traveled, and then now I live in Nashville, Tennessee. And so it's been just music, just the craving for diverse, just so much more music genres and cultures that actually brought to America by immigrants. And but at the time when I came to America as an undergrad student, I didn't know that much about the diversity of American culture. I just thought it was just like one big Hollywood blur. And then I was just blown away by actually the first thing in American music was actually West African drum ensemble, Indian raga ensemble, and jazz, and marching band, and then to Oakland, to, it's like all these amazing musicians in the avant-garde jazz, and then New York, and then in Colorado was folk music, and now in Nashville, there's just country, folk, bluegrass. I just wanted to go wherever my next big dish I could learn how to cook up, kind of with my background. So I just have been a bless. And yeah, when I'm with Abby, we also have played at UC Irvine, and it's just been a wonderful journey for me.
So that's, I think, I mean, one of the other themes, if I'd thought about it for the introduction, is just that the diversity of both cultures, and the way in which from the other side it looks like there's just one. You were saying you just had this one image of America, and I think Te-Ping, for you, one goal of the book, I assume, is to kind of explode this notion of there being a single China or a single China story. So did you consciously try to set different stories in different locales, or did that just come when you started writing?
I think it just came really naturally. I mean, as a reporter with the Journal, I had traveled so much, and also personally, in the years before that too, throughout China, and meeting different people and seeing different landscapes, and everyone from elderly farmers to striving college students, and many of those characters who are evoked in the book. And you're absolutely right. I think with China, we need more stories, right? Like we need more of a multiplicity of stories, and so often, especially here in the US, we think of it as a monolith. We think about statistics, GDP, as a place where they have abstractions, or what we want to project onto the country. And it's so easy to lose sight of the human. And so what Land of Big Numbers is really trying to capture for readers is just that more nuanced sense of individual portraits, and a country full of people who are creative and funny and inventive, and striving and making a living in all kinds of ways in the cracks of the system. Something I think is so important to remember when we think about the country. And if you really do want to understand China, it necessitates a deeper view of its people. And so I'm so glad that you've put this event together, just to emphasize the importance of those individual stories and those connections.
Yeah, that's something that I think, ironically, that I think one of the things that the Chinese government, we aren't going to make this a political focus, but one of the the things that's been going on with the Chinese government is to try to present a unified view of China. And Xi Jinping has talked about telling the good China story as though it were a single story, whereas in fact, I think that mitigates against, I think, the understanding of it as a multiplicity, which can actually encourage empathy from the outsider understanding. So I think that has a value, and literature is one of the places to do that. Were you writing the short stories while you were a reporter, or was there a kind of a connection? Did you ever think when you were covering a story, when you were covering a reported story, oh, there might be something from my fictional side here, or these? How do you wear the two hats?
Sure. So I was very much writing the collection while I was a reporter in China, and it was just an experience of, and you've written journalism yourself too, so when you're writing a piece of course, you assemble so many interviews and you do all that work, but at the end of the day, so much is left on the cutting room floor. And for me, it was just a feeling of having these stacks of notes and details and observations from life around me, and really wanting so badly to try and evoke them and give them life somehow. I mean, it's so often at the end of the day, you write a story and then you walk away, and all that other world that you've gained entrance to and absorb just kind of evaporates. And for me, it was just really hard to stop thinking about many of these milieus that I was able to step into and felt grateful to see. I mean, just being a reporter there really did feel like such a tremendous privilege to get to see what was happening around me. I mean, China's just such a, as I'm sure many people in this room know, is such a deeply just a rich, incredibly evocative place that challenges you on every level and is so much to see and experience, and really only a fraction of which ever gets captured through headlines. And I think, in musing about this theme of the event, I think as a reporter, I sometimes think and have been asked recently about whether it's possible to get closer to truth through fiction or through literature. And the way that I think about it is just, it's not necessarily closer to truth, but it is much more complete truths. And when you are parceling out the world in 800-word slices, as I mostly did in Beijing, I mean, necessarily you miss so much of the sweep and the scope. And beyond that, also just the intimate and the human and the personal, what is relevant to a reader through, in headlines in a major Western newspaper is obviously just a tiny bit of what makes a country and a society. And so, yeah, I mean, so much of what I'm trying to capture in Land of Big Numbers for readers is just this view onto a world that is so much more layered than we typically get to see in our own reading, in our own day-to-day lives. And thinking about the importance of fiction, when we think about how we come to understand the world, I mean, we piece together our understanding of the world through news, through maybe your uncle's slideshow of his trip to China, and all these things that are revealing in their own way. But to just there's such a deep importance that comes with trying to offer up more representations of a world and of a people. And I always think of fiction as just this like radical act of imagination, right? And the ability to read a book and to see yourself in other characters, we think often, I think we celebrate traits like compassion and kindness and empathy. And all of that, of course, is so important. But to me, what underpins it all is in many ways curiosity. And as readers, I think if we follow that instinct and we think about the world and want to step outside our own narrow perspective and engage more deeply with other people, other places, I mean, that's so much of what being human fundamentally is about, and something to celebrate, I think.
Great. Fei, I think, one of the things I was thinking about preparing to talk to you is that Americans often grow up with very little sense of Chinese music, or thinking of it only as something very strange, whereas you grew up presumably knowing something about Western music and studying it and things like that. So I just wonder how, I know with the album that you released with Abigail Washburn last year is just an amazing experiment in part on bridging this kind of musical divide, and you you blend together a Chinese folk song and an American folk song, both of which have to do with water, crossing water. So I was wondering if you could, tell the listeners about that song. I mean, they can listen to it on, I think, Smithsonian site. If you Google Fei Abigail Washburn Smithsonian, you'll get a version of it. But what are your strategies for somehow teaching people with American ears to hear your music and to think of it not as so strange? And if you could talk about it a little bit and then play something, that would be a real treat.
From my experience, I'm not sure. I have not actually experienced the American audience. Every time I play in front of a Western audience, I've always had a very positive response. I think in terms of education, I think it's really important. I would have a comparison to, let's say, even from elementary school in America versus how I grew up. The music that I feel very lucky that I remember my childhood growing up in China. The music on the radio and on TV, there was a lot of global music. The melodies I grew up was from Japan, Russia, Algeria, Sri Lanka, Philippines. There's a big performing troupe called 东方歌舞团. Called the Oriental Performing Troupe. That since I was a kid, I always wanted to dream to be a member of that, because that's the only orchestra that played music from all over the world, dance from Africa. So I'm not sure now anymore if they're doing that, but when I was growing up there, my childhood was filled with music from everywhere, from Brazil. So that's only my experience. And then now my kids are going to schools here. Maybe only playing American music from, as growing up, and then you don't have, it's kind of like food. If you are used to eating all kinds of food, you don't feel strange when you grow up. It's like just part of your, and then you crave that flavor, either in your stomach or your hearing as you grow up. So I think, and then I never had that concept of me being a foreign sound, to be honest. I was like, hey, check this out. Like, I want to play this for you. And then, so I think playing really sincerely. And also when I look at the guzheng, I don't know why, I just don't see it as another instrument. I was like, this is a big guitar. It's like, you guys have zithers, I have zithers, you have dulcimer, you have dulcimer, everywhere I have dulcimer. So it's just like, tune a little bit different. And then it's like, today I'm gonna add a little bit of wasabi to change my hamburger. And then, hey, and it tastes good. It just, that's how I feel. So especially, and then when I collaborate with artists from either America or Europe or Latino America, or other parts of Asia, I think I just never felt, okay, we have an agenda to, from the top, we need to do this. I would just feel like I am. So like what Te-Ping was, like the curiosity about another culture. It's like, wow, we can cook up a new thing, just you and I. And I see the artists as individuals instead of, oh, you represent that big blur, I represent this big blur. And then I've done collaborations that way, but it's kind of stiff that way. And then the sounds is never moving because you got this bigger cultural agenda. You got to tape the two big blur thing, and then it's one big blur. But every time when I play with someone just as an individual, like, the friendship with Abby, and then we're just like, hey, we're mothers, our babies are crying. So for example, the water song, Water is White, we were just sitting on the porch of like, what do you sing to your baby to put your kid to bed? It's like exhausting. So and Abby said, oh, well, I know this song. And then she starts singing, oh, wait, I know another song. So it's more of a thinking about like real living. that's the power, I think, of music. So from real living, and then we share the common feeling of being exhausted or being happy or being sad and being hungry and being motivated, rather than, oh, let's figure out this scale is this scale, how about in this rhythm? And then all of a sudden the human elements is completely taken out of the context. It's just like concept matching concept. So anyway, so I like to show this one, the water. And the Chinese song is actually from the He people, which is the tiniest ethnic group from northern China, actually near Harbin. The He people, the Usuli River that runs between China and Russia is the people who have lived on the Usuli River bank, and it's their boat song. Is basically, you know, they live on the boats on the river, and a mother singing a lullaby to the child while fishing and then rocking to the baby to sleep. So it's really about that. And so what Abby and then Abby started singing The Water is Wide. It's also, we took that kind of approach of water connecting everywhere, because you can't put a border on water. So it's really just one big thing, you know, from Scotland traveling to America and then goes to Pacific and then goes there. So we're all just one big piece. Excuse me. All right, so beginning is.
That was wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
I love the way you use food metaphors in talking about it so much. We did an event like this. Emily Baum, my colleague, moderated a discussion with Fuchsia Dunlop and Miranda Brown, who does the history of Chinese food, and Yong Chen at Irvine, who does Chinese food in America. And I do think that idea of mixing and matching elements, and sometimes forgetting, not always being conscious of borrowing from one place to another. And that's, you know, how traditions often develop, but then we make them more rigid. So that's a great example of that.
I completely agree. Like what even earlier Te-Ping was saying about the book and her experience is really the individual, the curiosity about each other. That's more powerful and more real and closer to truth. And then if historically every culture that has, you know, sparked something that's kind of changed history. If we look back a few hundred years ago or 1,000 years ago, even the Silk Road, 2,000 years ago, is people kept traveling, and then they got there and then made friends in real life, and then boom, it sparkled some new thing, and then that kept going. So I think that's much more powerful on the ground to do these yeah, like friends
now
making.
I really want a hamburger with wasabi on it. You've made me very hungry.
Well,
We got
yeah, in Culver City, you could find dumplings, a cheeseburger dumpling, which is yeah, one of the experiments there. But the Silk Road's another example of something that can be thought of as about exchange, really, and flowing. James Millward, the historian, has written a very short introduction to the Silk Road for Oxford that plays up the idea of it as a place of exchange and transformations that flowed in different directions, as opposed to the idea, I mean, the Belt and Road is kind of a one-directional single flow. And since Jim is also a musician, he brings in musical examples, and he would love your idea of they're just different guitars of different shapes and different numbers of strings, yeah, that float around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Te-Ping, would you read something for us to finish the kind of show and tell side of it, and then they're going to start. And please, audience, send in questions. So far, we've gotten two things that aren't really questions. One is just Tom Gold from up in Berkeley said that to mention that Te-Ping's interviewed in the San Francisco Chronicle today. And then we just had another person weighing in from I don't know where, just saying, wow, that was really good after Fei's discussion. So, but, questions are fine too to be part of this, but first, Te-Ping, if you
Yeah, and I just want to say I love what you were saying about a childhood that was steeped in so many influences, right? Like I think so often there's a temptation in China, which is in many ways reinforced by the party, to think of China as this one sort of hermetic thing, and just appreciating that it really is, it's a place that has always been a place of confluences. Yeah, I loved hearing that just so richly detailed in your own life and art. And yes, that what you played was just extraordinary. So I'll read a little bit from one of the stories in Land of Big Numbers, which is, since we were speaking about the neighborhood where I lived in Beijing, Beijing, that area, it's a story that is very much intended to evoke that particular neighborhood. And it goes like this. It was sorry, I've not read this aloud, so I'm sure I'm gonna stumble. It was a peculiar fruit, the orange-red tawny skin, its flesh dense and velvety and luxurious. It was shaped roughly like an egg, with a tiny yellow pit, sold packed into crates lined with its deeply green leaves. The fruit had a taste marvelous and rare, sweet with an underside of acid. We lined up for blocks to buy it from street peddlers. We exchanged bites, though never satisfactorily. What tasted to me like the look of freshly arranged sunflowers in a green vase might taste to you like the way your daughter's tiny socked feet sounded romping down the hall. For Lao Zhou, it smelled like it did when he wiped the shavings off a bench he'd carved himself and applied a creamy varnish. For Ju Ai, it was the scent of her mother cooking rice, long remembered from childhood, and the sound of rain outside. For others, it was a look of mingled envy and admiration that came when you were young and beautiful and wearing something new that suited you exactly. The fruit had arrived one day in trucks at the city's wholesale market in crates that said Sunshan Produce, sharing space with peaches and plums and grapes and other fruit with which we were more familiar. At first, it was just the peddlers who sold the fruit, who'd picked it up because it was cheap and novel and sweet. But soon grocery stores were stocking it too, under the name Chiguo, peculiar fruit. Lao Zhou was the first on the street to try it. He was a widower who woke early every morning and did his shopping, was usually among the first at the neighborhood market. One day in April, he came back with a dozen of the fruit, swaying in a plastic bag, and handed them to anyone he saw. Try it, he said, an alertness in his voice that surprised us. Pang Ai, out for a stroll, took one curiously. The first bite made her cheeks burn softly pink. Oh, she said. Oh, how tasty. Those of us who stood watching the exchange between her and Lao Zhou raised our eyebrows. There was something private in that moment, even though Pang Ai was frequently found gossiping while squatting in the common privies, and it would not have occurred to us, to any of us, to suspect her of holding anything in reserve. It had been an especially frigid winter, months of chapped lips and living off stalks of stewed cabbage, months in which we had turned up our coat collars and nodded to each other in passing, and kept to ourselves and turned the television up high. By the time the Chiguo arrived, spring was just making itself felt, and it was a relief to shed our coats and walk unencumbered. Those of us who ate the qiguo noticed that the sun was warm on our limbs, and that the sound of a bicycle bell tinkling outside reminded us of the warm air, of the spring breeze, of possibilities. We smiled more often, let our eyes meet in the street. Today I had one that tasted like I had just told a good joke and everyone was laughing, Lao Sui might say. Mothers would feed matched up pieces of the fruit to their babies, and we'd crowd around to watch the surprise and wonder that transformed their small faces. We were kinder to one another that season. Mr. Feng, who worked at a local bank, tasted a qiguo one morning, and afterward it occurred to him that the metal door at the entrance to the apartment building was sticking, so that the elderly woman who lived on the first floor could sometimes be seen standing outside, waiting for a neighbor to enter or exit so she could slip in behind them. He grabbed some pliers and went downstairs to see whether he could fix it. Other changes happened, big and small. To everyone's astonishment, Ju Ai's son, who lived with her on the third floor, quit his job at a local factory and moved south to be a painter. He had taken a bite of the qiguo and, so he said, seen a sunset of moist silver and cloudy gold that he was determined to capture on canvas. No matter, so his mother said, that he had no talents and would come to a bad end. Lao Zhou, who worked as the neighborhood handyman, was often seen eating the fruit. That spring, he found himself singing more often as he swung his hammer, feeling a long dormant restlessness in his blood. He noticed the young girls in the neighborhood were wearing high-waisted skirts. It seemed to be the new fashion. He noticed the far-off sound of a revving engine in the distance. The day he'd given Pang Ai her first piece of the fruit, he noticed that the shape of her waist was still visible, even in the baggy shirt she wore now. And though they had known each other for years, there was a freshness about her eyes that surprised him. For the first time, it occurred to him, tasting qiguo, that he was not yet an old man. And it goes on from there. And the story takes twists. The fruit goes through different seasons and changes, and it becomes something of a metaphor for society. But it was a story that I loved getting to write, and a very special particular place and community in Beijing that I had very much in mind when I was writing it. And there's a lot of different partisans for stories in the book, but this is one of my favorite because it does capture, I think, a kind of tenderness to life there that does exist. And also too, it's one of the stories in this collection that is much more infused with magical realism, this sort of supernatural fruit that comes to a neighborhood and transforms it. Which for me, and we were talking earlier about literature and why literature and all that, I really did feel like magical realism and was just a fun and it was a way to get to try and conjure up what modern China can feel like to readers, again, beyond the headlines. And some of what is just so extraordinary about the country, that feeling of always living on the precipice of possibilities, of change, of the unexpected, and just viscerally surprising. And so, yes, in New Fruit, we see that in the small Beijing neighborhood. Elsewhere in the book, we meet a robot that makes noodles and funeral strippers, which is a real phenomenon in China, which I did write a little very short dispatch about for the Wall Street Journal, as well as one about these robots that make noodles. And there's magic in the book, but also details like that, which are very much real and drawn from real life, including the fruit in this story, which was inspired by the nectarine sold in that hutong where I lived in Beijing, and which were just so good. If you're ever in Beijing, like in July, and you see them sitting out, just buy 20 of them and sit there and eat them. They're magical. Not quite as magical in the story though.
That is a wonderful story, and it's great. We didn't plan this, but food is a connecting thread between comments in both, which is natural. And one of the things that I thought of also that I hadn't really thought through in my mind, connecting the two of you as artists, is this kind of refusal to be limited by genre, because your collection of stories isn't. We're hearing a lot about Chinese science fiction. There are writers who just write science fiction. There are science fiction elements, magical realism elements, but also some stories that are completely realist. That. And on Twitter this morning, I think Sabina Knight, who's worked on Chinese literature and on Mo Yan, tweeted, I think it's Mo Yan's birthday, and he's somebody who's often associated with magical realism, and winning the Nobel Prize. Well, we're starting to get some questions in, so I'm going to sort of shift to that. They continue this conversation nicely. One is by, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, Saifullah Ozkert. Thank you. You're both really inspiring. How do you find ways to go beyond the embrace of quote unquote diversity without a real understanding of the other, except as something different and exotic? And I think this is a kind of, yes, this issue of keeping, and the fruit is a perfect way of doing this, keeping it strange and interesting and different without exoticizing. I don't know if either of you want to think of how you do that. I mean, you want it to feel strange, but you don't want people to go away just thinking, oh, that was different. You also want them to think it's relatable, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, and so in Land Big Numbers, a number of the stories, as you mentioned, are told in a very much more realist kind of tone. I think maybe one element to the question too, if I'm understanding it correctly, is how do you keep diversity from just being something that feels really superficial and something that you pay lip service to? And for me, in some ways, I think of fiction very much as an antidote to that, or any kind of art that requires you to engage. I mean, that's something that makes journalism and fiction very different from each other. Journalism, I think of as there's often, something that you're trying to impart, there's a message, whereas fiction, I think of as such a participatory experience where it's asking something of a reader too. It's not just handing you answers, and it's asking you to really engage and create your own response. And so I think that is something that draws me to the form too, this feeling that it's some ways presenting a challenge to readers and asking them to rise to meet it and to really engage. I don't know if that.
From my perspective, because my upbringing, I grew up in China and then came to the States in the middle of my early 20s. I never felt that I was, I was the majority of, everywhere I grew up was Chinese or East Asian looking, entire like 2 billion people all over Asia. So I just didn't grow up in thinking I'm a diversity. I was the absolute majority. And so when I came here, I think that thinking was already formed. So I felt like everywhere in America is a big diversity to me. And I still feel that way. But I have to kind of conceptually this is what's happening in America. I'm still understanding as a new immigrant. I'm still understanding that aspect of American culture and learning more about the history. So it's I may not be or I just also as an individual music creator. Maybe it's just my personality. I never had a thinking of having to be liked by anyone. I mean, it's I do this and I want to go there and check that out. So I'm bringing this giant boat with me and I'm there. And then next I'm going there. And so it's, haven't never thought about how do I stand out? I just don't think like that.
All right, this is a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I would off of what you were saying. I mean, growing up as an American of ethnic Chinese descent, even though I was raised in the Bay Area, which is a really wonderfully diverse place, I absolutely felt conscious of, I think, what this question is about. This feeling of being the diverse. Just in many ways, you think about being tokenized and worry about those sorts of expressions. And it's something that I struggled with this book, especially in the presentation of it. I remember very much talking with my publisher saying, oh God, please do not put a panda on the cover. Please do not put on a dragon, no red, no gold. just, but there, it's hard too, because of course people want to know the book is about China, and how do you signal that in a way that doesn't come across as just hit you over the head, so crude and literal, and playing into, of course, all these deep-seated sort of tropes, and so it's a hard question. It's a good question. I think the hope that I have is just to try and engage and create work that expands on our notion of what it does mean to be Chinese. And so when you think about the characters in the stories, you know, not encountering some of those more reflexive tropes that populate other art or fiction, perhaps, or have at periods in the past, but you get to encounter things that are surprising and just that expand your notion of what China is, right? Like when people think about China, I don't think they usually think of rural inventors who are trying to build airplanes, which is one character that you meet in the book. So I think in writing this, really trying to find and get to highlight those aspects of China that surprised me, and that I found to be so, just all those really vivid, interesting, and compelling details that really did, in many ways, explode my notion of China and the things that I expected to encounter there.
So this is a question from Tom Gold for particularly Fei. Does Wu Fei have thoughts on inventive music from Taiwan, such as Lin Shengxiang, an environmental activist who invents his own instruments, or moving sound? I don't know those, but have you come across these?
I have not heard about the name, but anyone who invents is an inventor. I would love to know, because it's, you know, that's just how music or anything, you know, like literature, we're all inventors. I don't see people like, you know, oh, you're part of that map and you're part of this map. We're just the same. We're just a newer, you know, Homo sapiens sapiens, and and so that, you know, so that's how I see it. I would love to check out the artists, and and being inventive is definitely the best way for music, for any music from any culture, not just for Chinese culture.
I was thinking also with this question back about exoticizing, one of the things that I think explodes some exotic is just when you play a melody that people associate with a Western song on a guzheng, you're immediately exploding the idea of sort of what, because you play things that sound like bluegrass, and you play things that sound like did you grow up trained in classical composition? Am I remembering right? Or
yes, I started learning basically a Western classic, besides instrumentally, but also piano, and then Western music theory, ear training. The textbooks were all from Moscow and Paris. So for, you know, learning Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and so all that since I was very young, like 9 years old. And joining music competitions, like recognizing a symphony, a sound by playing, only give you 3 seconds, and then you just name it, boom, and then you click it's like Price is Right, boom, and then, you know, it's just like all Western classical sounds. None was actually Chinese traditional sound. So back then, so in my upbringing, I had lots of, besides the Chinese sound, it was a lot of Western, or not even Western, just outside China. A lot of element, a lot of Russian music, a lot of South American sounds, and Japanese, and so because I grew up like China was really opening up, like eagerly to want to be embraced and to embrace what's outside, because China has been closed for so long, and the whole country wanted to see outside and to have outside to come to see us. I was born after the Cultural Revolution was completely over, so the country was at a very different stage, and therefore I think in the advantage of that was really just sucked in a lot of anything internationally that we could get. So so though that's all been part of me in my kind of like the ingredients, I would, you know, kind of bring it out. Oh, you know, from and then So, and then plus my own curiosity, the more you hear these kind of global sound, the more you want to, you know, I don't know, even like bring in my own, but the guzheng definitely has is one of the kind of the ancient Chinese sounds that you can't get rid of that sound. It's just the physical design of the body somehow just rings, you know, one bending like that will bring you back to 2,000 years ago. And it's somehow that magic, I can, you know, get rid of it. I don't want to, but besides that, there are just so many little things. You just treat it like a little machine, and then you add your own imagination, your own fantasy. I mean, even if there's only a piece of rock in front of you, you can turn into a symphony. And that's your imagination. That's what artists should do, rather than be the servant to the thing. I think that's how I see it.
That's wonderful. There's a question from Jing Liu to Te-Ping. Did you find any difference between Chinese living in China and those living in the United States? If so, any thoughts on this comparison? Or maybe one of the ways is that you do have some characters in the stories who are Americans who go to China, who move between the places, either Chinese who end up in America. So I think maybe this would be a way to talk about the way for each of you, the diaspora experience fits into your art.
Yeah, so the characters, as Jeffrey mentions, there are some that are part of the diaspora abroad, well-educated, living in the US, in relationships and in love. And for me, in my experience being in China, being someone of ethnic Chinese descent and arriving in China, in terms of the differences that I felt between myself and people there, profound. Like on every level. I was raised in a completely different country and political and cultural system. Of course, there were many aspects of my childhood that had brought in traditions from my grandparents' generation, but they were also artifacts in so many ways of the pre-communist world and an entirely different era for China, and also specific to Southern China. And so, I mean, we're speaking about the diversity of China and the Chinese experience, and to talk about food again, because of course, who doesn't love to talk about food? I remember, I mean, so many degrees of surprise and things that I discovered living in China. And some of them were just culinary. The fact that people in China also eat potatoes and pumpkins, and just like, because I'd grown up with like a really like Cantonese kind of diet, just all these like big and small, everything from what we, of course, that staple of culture, cuisine, to ways that we thought about the world, just on every level. I couldn't even begin to describe how radically different I felt from people in China. And yet at the same time too, I think also felt a lot of resonance and an emotional attachment, a really deep emotional attachment to the country. And so much of my first reaction when I came to China in 2006 as a student, which was really this profound sense of shock and dislocation and sorrow too, in some ways, having been raised in a household that really did take this idea of being Chinese very seriously and valued it enormously, but also, being raised in a family that would tell stories of old Beijing and the Hutong where my grandmother had been raised, which of course by the time I arrived had mostly been destroyed. And so trying to navigate this world and understand it for me, and through that lens of being someone from this same shared sort of history, but of course one that had diverged so radically, was something that just, of course, really shaped my experience of China, and something that I struggle with too. Jeffrey and I were talking earlier about this essay that I wrote in last weekend's Wall Street Journal about this feeling of being Chinese, and how it really is something that over time, when I was growing up in the 90s as a kid here in the States, and for me, feeling very much like that cultural identity of being Chinese was just that. It was cultural, it was about food, it was about Lunar New Year, it was about, you know, the Chinese classes I went to. And it was very much about family. It felt really in very minimally political. And at this point, because China's stature and position and activity on the global stage is so different, in some ways the political feels like it's subsumed the cultural at points in ways that are uncomfortable, or at least certainly the emotions that it occasions complex, right? And how to think about what it means to be Chinese at this very different point in time, and how to talk about it, and feeling that sense of conflict too, given that the Chinese Communist Party, of course, has very much asserted itself as kind of the standard bearer of Chinese culture. And so for me, in writing these stories and trying to think about what my work in this collection stands for, in a lot of ways, is about just the sense of wanting to claim identity as being distinct from the government, and in wanting to focus on and really celebrate this idea of individual stories, which and again, you know, that underpins this notion that there is not one vision of what it means to be Chinese. It's so many things. And I think often of my great grandfather, since we're talking about family, late in my time in Beijing, I stumbled on a forgotten chapter of my own family's history, in which I found these old family letters, which led me to discover that actually my great-grandfather had been a poet and an English language journalist in Beijing, almost exactly 100 years before I had moved there to do the same thing. And in fact, actually lived like just about a mile away from where I lived in Beijing. And there was just this wonderful serendipity there. But anyway, in terms of how it relates here, it was just, he was a Chinese intellectual who believed very much in this vision of a democratic China, one that he thought could be realized and advocated for. And if history had gone differently, you know, perhaps could have been realized. And so, and I bring this up because I think when we focus on those sorts of stories, when we talk about those sorts of stories and remember those sorts of stories, China is billions of stories. And when we think about and remember those individual stories, I mean, they are the ones that really contain just such a multitude of possibilities that exist for China's future.
Wow. And I mean, talking about family, and you don't have to go into any of the details of this, Wu Fei, but you're in a sense living through an example of multiple generations of people from China adjusting to America and thinking about America, seeing it through your parents' eyes, who didn't grow up in the cosmopolitan world that you did, and now raising children who are feeling probably a different way connected to America. So just in your one household, you explode any notion of there being a single diaspora experience.
Yeah, it's been a pretty interesting experience. Because there's a saying called 上有老下有小, you know, to describe my generations. You got to look after the old and the young in one household. And so that's where I am. I always thought, oh, I'm always a baby, never restart. Like I'm really in the middle of this. And yeah, so it's been really positive, especially during the pandemic, because having family together, you feel really is a source of strength. But at the same time, my parents, they didn't, you know, they never even like left Beijing until they're in their 70s. So, you know, boom, all of a sudden in the middle of Nashville, Tennessee. So that's like the image of America to them. And then since they haven't been able to really gone out of Tennessee much because the pandemic broke out like a few months after they arrived, so they've only kind of been learning about America from TV, and then they don't speak English, so they've been just kind of watching some weird Chinese program in Chinese language. I was like, oh no, don't believe that. And you know, when there's like democracy, it's really wonderful, but in a way that like everyone gets to say. And then for someone who's in their 70s, they're just from one extreme. of understanding what media means. And then to this extreme, there's no overlap or transition. So I had to stop them from, only believing that, and now to only believe. I was like, no, you can't always just immediately believe what you watch from TV.
So you're homeschooling two generations. You're homeschooling.
Also the experience of being an American and dealing with like older relatives who are watching TV too.
Oh my goodness! Like I was like, no, this is conspiracy. Do you understand the word conspiracy? And then they're like, ah. So it was kind of try to avoid conversation sometimes. I can understand how American families that they really don't like holidays, because when they sit around each other talking about holidays and then they start a domestic war sort of thing. Now, I understand that. So, but still, like, it's different because we are the only source of trying to explain what America's about, because they don't understand in the language, and then they can't really make a quick and clear pick of where the source. They're like, what do you mean by 5 different news sources? There's really just one, right? We just believe what we watch. It was like, no, even just how you. So it's, but it's really great for my children. They, they are the children of like, our first generation immigrants, and they were born both in Beijing but moved here when they were babies. So we, at the beginning, we thought, having no grandparents, because my in-laws live in New Zealand, so it's just like being scattered all over the world. Is seeing one relative is like a zillion miles. And so when my parents moved here, I feel that the children have grandparents. I didn't grow up with grandparents, so but they now have, and it's really, really sweet to see that. From both sides, and also my dad is a good cook. So everyone, friends ask me, so what's the best Chinese food in Nashville? Like, in my kitchen. So that's really been wonderful. So I think overall it's given me strength that I feel like a real adult, whether I choose to be or not. But this is feeling like being a real adult, to be able to do this. I see as a gift. Yeah.
This is great. I could just keep talking to you both endlessly, and I think it's been a wonderful thing. I'll end with the last kind of comment. It's a question, but it's kind of a comment, so maybe can end with that. Te-Ping Chen, who wrote, "This is a wonderful program. He grew up in Hangzhou, came over to the US in '87, living in Irvine, care very much about the well-being of Chinese Americans. Actually says he's a good friend of yours, Wu Fei, so he feels like this program was like created just for him." And his question was, are we aware of efforts being made today by regular people to improve the relationship between the two countries? And I do think that in some ways, I mean, there are always things about formal people-to-people programs, and I really hope that the Fulbright program, which was stopped, will be restarted again. It was a Fulbright program that I was on my first trip to China in 1986, Fulbright Hays, and I think Te-Ping, you went.
Yeah, I was going to say same. No, I wrote my first novel while on my Fulbright in China.
Oh, this is great. We get every good review about your novel, every good review about your fiction will say this is one of the unexpected payoffs of the Fulbright program. But I do think this kind of what you're both doing creatively is another way of trying to have regular people improve. Not that either of you are regular people, you're both extraordinary, but it is something that can help improve the relationship. It's just simply reading across borders, listening across borders. So thank you both for your generosity and sharing your ideas, your music, your fiction.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure. Thank you everyone for coming.
Great. I'm so glad this was recorded so that people can tune in. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.